Excellent. All right. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today we are having some excitement, some public theological excitement with Kyle Roberts from United Theological Seminary, an Pathos blogger and friend, and like one of my friends that's taken way too long to have on the podcast to ever get to interact in public. We've only taught classes together, but never recorded anything. So Kyle, thanks for being part of this and jumping on right here live on the interwebs.
You're welcome. Thanks for bringing me on.
Well, we are going to talk about public theology. We're going to talk about the pastor as a public theologian, what Christians do when they're talking about their theology in social media during election year. Apparently, Kyle's going to talk about how social science can help us figure these things out. I thought he might want to end talking about the Bible. I don't know if he has time or even wants to, because you know what those crazy unorthodox theologians like Kyle do. They may just skip the Bible altogether. But nonetheless, we'll be talking about that. And if you're joining us live, then just drop some questions in the Q&A, and we can discuss them. I have 5 questions that were already sent in from Homebrewed Christianity community members. So if you are one of those members and you're saying to yourself, do I need to retype the question I already gave you? You don't have it. Some of them aren't here because they are working, but they're members of the website, so I always ask their questions too, so they get to hear it. Now, first, before we go in, I want you to explain to us what public theology is, and don't assume we even know. I know what systematic theology is because that's what real theologians do. But public theology, what's that?
Yeah, people sometimes squint their eyes when you say public theology. You know, there are so many variations, definitions, whatever, understandings of what public theology is. I'm not going to go through them all because that'd bore everybody to tears. But basically, it's theology that explicitly attends to live social questions that face society, a culture, group of people working through issues. It's non-sectarian. It's another way to put it. Theology that brings its own presuppositions and questions and concerns into a situation of dialogue, a situation in which the theologian might have something to contribute to larger public questions and concerns.
So what would the difference between public theology and, let's say, apologetic theology or biblical theology? Like, when I think of theologians that talk in public, they either tend to be ones that quote Bible verses as if everyone knows exactly what they mean, and then they tend to have conclusions that follow it that don't sound like ancient conclusions, but nonetheless, they're pretty confident. Or the public theology gets turned into some type of contesting of truth in which success equals someone agreeing with you, and it takes an apologetic tone.
Yeah, I'd say that public theology vis-a-vis apologetics, particularly the kind of classical version of apologetics that I grew up with as a conservative evangelical in my background, apologetics was about winning the argument or winning someone over to your particular faith, your version of the faith even. Public theology is not so much about winning an argument as an end goal, as it is engaging in a larger conversation, using the resources of theology, the traditions that one brings to bear on difficult, complex questions. So those resources then become fodder, they become fuel, they become tools to engage in a public square, to engage with people from other faiths without necessarily trying to convert them to your faith, but to solve problems.
And how would you describe how public theology today is different than, say, public theology prior to really contemporary pluralism, a kind of secular understanding of the public square. I mean, I feel like public theology today, one of the reasons that questions that we're discussing come up and why people were like, oh, y'all should talk about this, is because what you do as a Christian or a minister on social media, in a pulpit, during election year, in interfaith dialogues, all those are questions that the church, at least for most of its history after it became dominant, didn't spend much time asking.
Yeah, and you sort of brought up post-secularism, and I know you're familiar with the secularization thesis, the idea that soon after the turn of the 20th century, this sort of the sense that sociologists had previously was that we were going to enter this kind of purely secular age where religion gets marginalized and pushed to the outskirts of really anything relevant to public social life. Well, we haven't seen that. We've actually seen a resurgence of religion and even civil religion, the use of religious symbols and practices in a very public way. If you're paying attention to the Republican convention right now, you see civil religion on, kind of on stage at work in our social life. You see it. And so I think that the challenge and opportunity for the pastor as public theologian, which is really what we're talking about, is not the professional academic theologian so much as how does the pastor, as a religious leader of a faith community, enter into a very complicated pluralistic context where it's important to be respectful of differences, but to think about those differences as opportunities, again, to solve problems creatively, and to kind of communicate with each other in a better, more peaceful way. Religion often leads to to a more unhappy situation of conflict and violence, and it can turn that direction too. But can the public theologian utilize the resources of his or her faith tradition to contribute more positively and meaningfully to the social life that we live together?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually connects to one of the questions that they got sent in, and this is an Episcopal minister in flyover country asking this question. So there's you some context. As a pastor, I see myself as a theologian in the congregation, but with many tasks. One is to present the gospel so that each person understands themselves as loved and affirmed, and to make the gospel prophetically challenge their assumptions that keep them uninvested in addressing poverty, justice, caring for the planet, and things like that. The lectionary texts that we get regularly have a prophetic edge, but one I've only learned to hear through my theological education, and because I've had experiences with different types of Christians and non-Christians, and actually volunteered and things in my seminary experience to know the underside of American culture. Even though Episcopalians tend to think of themselves as progressive, they're also bourgeois and rarely have interactions with people in the bottom half of the economic ladder. How do you mediate your pastoral responsibility with your responsibility to the prophetic edge of the Christian text and hold both in some dialectical integrity? Oh, that was a long question, and it sounds like an intense one.
It's a great question. I'm from flyover country. I guess I still live in flyover country. If Minnesota counts, probably does.
I feel like Minneapolis and St. Paul are like, they're like where you want to have layovers in flyover country, except when it's snowing.
That's true. Well, you got the warm airport, but whatever. It's an excellent question. I mean, the public theologian, the pastor's public theologian, I think really walks a fine line, because if they do see their role, their vocation as having a prophetic function, not just a pastoral priestly function, which is of course integral, important to the role of the pastor, but also that prophetic, then I think what you're trying to do there is something that's very difficult, and that is to expose people's blind spots. Pete Enns had a great blog post that came out today or yesterday that's sort of gone around, and he makes some excellent points about the prophetic function of the prophets in the Old Testament and Jesus in terms of, what was their role in relation to politics and to the reigning political regime ideologies of their day. And his point was that primarily their role was self-critical. That is, it was to turn a critical eye not on the culture out there, but rather on the hypocrisies, the idolatries that take up residence within our own hearts and our own communities. And so I think that the pastor really does, if he's going to take or she's going to take a prophetic role in that vocation, needs to learn to walk that line. And it's tough. It's tough to do it. But to speak prophetically by exposing the blind spots, such as, our questioner wants to do. How do you do that? Well, that's a harder and longer answer. Probably takes a lifetime to even figure out. But there are people certainly who are trying to do it with greater or lesser levels of probably success. And how do you know if the prophet is even successful? Mm-hmm. You may not know until the end of your career. So in your life even.
Well, one of the things that Walter Brueggemann kind of talks about in the prophetic imagination is how the prophets, they expose ideology by appealing to the reality of the world. And that when oftentimes I think when the prophetic voice of the pastor functions not to point towards the lived reality of people and then say, tell me the good news, but to some carefully crafted, overeducated political option that's on the table, mm-hmm. then those are two different tasks. Like, you don't get Jeremiah going, well, here's the thing. Here's how you should reorganize the tax code. And when you do that, you could invest in public education in rural areas this way. But in inner cities, the competition of charter schools with new expectations on the nature of the teachers themselves could really be an environment to cultivate new ideas that then later could be exported to agricultural areas. But you wouldn't want to take those risks without people having economic options in rural areas. So I feel like this is he never does that. Yeah. But there's a sense that our ideology as people of privilege, which is kind of most Americans, when you look in the global context, is one that's hard to get. The lived experience is like the principle of reality in which ideology gets revealed, as opposed to the prophet or the pastor as public theologian just handing some prescription that fixes everything.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we see Jesus operating in that same vein. He doesn't give detailed in the Gospels. He doesn't lay out detailed prescriptions for how the social order should be reorganized or the tax code. In fact, when he's questioned along those lines, what should we do with this imperial tax, Jesus? Should we pay it or should we not pay it? Should we be compliant or should we be revolutionary? He sort of answers with this riddle, well, show me the coin. And so he's drawing on the wisdom tradition and answering in a very ambivalent way that just perplexes the questioners, and they're not sure what to do. He doesn't give them this, So I think it is more about the prophetic function of the pastor must be something like, yes, exposing idolatries, but to draw on Kierkegaard a little bit, you can't do that directly very well because people resist direct communication. You're better off trying some indirect methods, parables and riddles and asking hard questions, raising scenarios and so forth to kind of get the person thinking about the issues for themselves,
Well, sticking with Kierkegaard for a minute, because I don't think a lot of people think of Kierkegaard as this a public theologian. They mostly think of him as, oh, this isn't the early existentialist, father of existentialism, the offense of the gospel, that kind of thing. If you pause with Kierkegaard long enough to think about him as a model for doing public theology, what kind of insights do you get from that type of indirect communication?
Yeah, so Kierkegaard was very interested in the subjectivity of the self, and so the existentialism that is spawned from that tends to lead into a very kind of inward, introspective orientation. But he actually does have a much more social dimension to his thought than people give him credit for, and I think Kierkegaardians scholars have shown this to be the case. One of his most important and interesting books is called Works of Love, and he says that this book, Works of Love, Kierkegaard himself writes about the book and says that it is his vision of subjectivity, the development of the self and the authenticity of the self applied in a relational direction. Mm-hmm. So he's got these kind of beautiful things where he talks about neighbor love, and the neighbor is the first one you see, kind of thing. It's not the one living right next door to you that you like. But rather it's every person with whom you come into contact. And so there really is a social responsibility there in Kierkegaard that hasn't been, is being kind of drawn out more and more in later days. But the other thing is the critique of Christendom, which Kierkegaard is very well known for. Mm-hmm. And there are really good reasons to utilize Kierkegaard's prophetic imagination against the kind of nationalistic tendencies of people as we gather together and live together in groups, and he kind of wants to cut through that and say that that nationalism as an ideology is not really it's certainly not a Christian way to think of yourself and to organize yourself as a person in relation to society. Mm-hmm. So there's some really, I think, great resources in Kierkegaard that are being mined, but haven't really been fully mined.
Well, one of the things that makes me think of is, like, in one sense, we're not Denmark, where citizenship, baptism, and that kind of stuff is immediately connected. But I wonder if you think there's a connection between how Christendom functioned in Denmark and the way kind of the ideology of American exceptionalism functions today. Because if you're trying to think of something that will not be questioned at all during the Republican and Democratic National Convention, it will be American exceptionalism. And I mean, in the elements of it, and you may come up with others, but that in thinking about us having this conversation, is that it includes militarism. So real questions about militarism and nationalism are not on the table. It includes an assumption that we're best ruled by an oligarchy, but it won't admit that we ruled by one, but we'll structure how we choose our future presidents, the funding for it, and all that stuff. Those are not going to be questions on the table. We just assume an oligarchy. We don't question racism in really significant ways. We don't challenge white privilege. And if you look at what gets countered against it, it is the power of the state, right? Like Black Lives Matter, and then you have Homeboy going Blue Lives Matter, and you're like, yeah, this is awkward, but it's not like Democrats are wonderfully better at it. And to recognize the history of white privilege would require us to think through not just how we treated African slaves, but natives. And then when we imported Asian labor to build railways. I mean, there's so many things that get left off the table because of U.S. exceptionalism. And the other one was how we don't discuss how natural resources are used or how labor is protected. Those are now things that were protected at some point, and now it's like, who wants to minimize their protection the least, not assert the value of nature as something more than a resource for our economy, and labor as something more than a means to our national economic dominance.
Yeah, absolutely. For Kierkegaard, the crowd is untruth. The crowd is untruth, and this is a phrase he likes to use, which is to say that the collective, when a collective group overtakes the identity of the individuals involved, subsumes the identity of the individuals involved, and they begin to see themselves and understand themselves as a part of the collective rather than as a single individual with a distinctive flavor, a distinctive responsibility for oneself to live responsibly and ethically in the world before God, with God as the criterion for one's actions. This is the great problem of nationalism, precisely, and American exceptionalism, is that we begin to see ourselves as simply members of this greater collective, and tribalism sets in, and all of the bad things that go along with tribalism and allegiances. And then those with power in that structure, in that system, lose sight of those who are left out and are marginalized, and have to kind of fend for themselves within this larger system that is formed and dominated by this collective. And so I think that there again, subjectivity, responsibility, selfhood, and the doctrine of sin actually has a lot to contribute here, I think, in maybe some creative and interesting ways that, again, some are exploring, but not everyone has explored. But to say that we need to look really deeply and carefully and critically at ourselves as individuals and as this collective, to say, how is it that we have gotten to where we are? And what are we missing about ourselves? So, yeah.
All right. You mentioned sin. One of the questions was a really good sin one. Let me find it. All right, here we go. How does Kyle understand the nature of sin when it comes to dealing with public theology? A lot of the public questions are connected to social sin, and yet each of us as an individual participates, is complicit, and also feels powerless in many of these social things, while also having our own personal issues and intentional actions connected to it. As a minister, I feel guilty sometimes pushing the edge when I know there's not a whole lot different I could do if I really cared about an issue, while being very confident that God does. I completely know that experience. Because
Right.
like, just think of like the ecological crisis. I don't know how ambiguous God's been invested in bringing about sentient life in a biosphere for almost 14 billion years. The idea that we would take it out on this planet in a rather short period of time seems to be clear, just connected to the affirmation of the human dignity, the goodness of all creation, that God's against it. You can talk about it, you can raise conscience, and then what are you going to do? Change your light bulb and invest your money different? Like, you feel stuck. And so how does this, how do you, as a public theologian, in talking about things that totally fit sin, if you're going to manage to use the word anymore, how do you do it without everyone just going, but Al Gore, you flew an airplane here? What do you want me to do, change my light bulb?
Yeah, right. No, that's a great question. First of all, just how do I think about sin? I affirm original sin, not in the literal meaning of the Garden of Eden and a fall of two single individual persons and all that, but in the sense that in the development of the Homo sapien species, at some point, it just makes sense that there was a fall, that there was a increased consciousness and capability to make decisions and to strategize, and to turn to our own, let's just say, abilities to at the expense of that other group over there, that other tribe. And so anyway, there's a whole interesting avenues we could explore with that.
There's a social science guy, Brad Schmookler, who wrote a book called The Parable of Tribes about this. It's wonderful. But my favorite line in it is he said, in the same way that you are thrown into the world, and by the time you develop a conscience, you realize your grandparents are racist, and he's an American. So when Homo sapiens first found themselves in a world, they were holding a stick and already killing other people to get dinner. And one of the first truisms are that nice guys are finished first. And so, like, whenever the level of self-consciousness of Homo sapiens comes to evolve, you are inheriting biological patterns that are violent, and then evaluative patterns about the dignity of the human other that turns it into this type of question around evil and sin.
Yep. And then we could also add to that, you and I have had a conversation before about Ernest Becker and denial of death, and this very important theory that at the heart of human evil lies an awareness of our own mortality and finitude and frailty. And so we lash out against the threats, perceived or real.
Mm-hmm.
But, how do we perceive those threats? And that's where racism, prejudice, and all of that kind of fits in. And we're getting into those conversations now in the public life in terms of racism and prejudice and all that of course, they've been around a long time. But the impulse to protect and to preserve oneself and one's tribe, one's community at the expense of the other, I really think that's what sin's all about. And we all live at that. We all participate in that. We all contribute to it. So there is this really empirical reality to original sin and inherited sin and all of that. How do we counter that? That's the hard part, right? I mean, that's what takes just incredible, painstaking, reflective, critical, and prophetic work. And it seems like then the pastor comes in there, both as prophet and as priest, to point out this reality of the pervasiveness of sin and participation in structures, sinful structures. But then also the pastoral side to say that there's also compassion and forgiveness for sin and grace. And this is obviously at the heart of the Christian gospel message. And that tension between the awareness of sin and the prophetic function in pointing it out, but the priestly function in also reminding people of forgiveness and grace, that is actually, that reminder is as Luther emphatically asserted, is the very capacity, is what we need to be able to get out of the patterns of sin in the first place. And but yeah, it's just hard work. I think that the pastor really needs, if he or she wants to be self-consciously both prophetic and priestly, it's hard, but at the same time so necessary, so needed.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that just popped up asked what could be said, done to counter the fear that animates today's poetic activity, and I think, like, it's actually helpful to notice that a lot of that fear is actually contained poetically. That the structure of our language and the way we discuss and frame and imagine things, what we see is available to us and possible, is constitutively restricted by the way we describe the world, because our linguistic relations are the ways we actually communally share a vision of what's possible and what's beautiful and that kind of thing.
Yeah, how to combat the fear.
But it was supposed to be political activity, and I like poetical. I thought this was a theopoetic moment. But anyway, go ahead. But the fear question, I think, is very helpful.
Right. I think to acknowledge that there are things to be afraid of, so it's not minimizing the fact that there are real threats. But it's also, I think, really helpful to say that in the acknowledgement of that, to underscore our frailty and mortality and say that's the way that it is. And I remember that that passage where Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and Peter says, "No, Jesus, you can't go. You're not going to die. You will never die. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." So the way Peter was framing his vision of the Messiah and what the Messiah was about was that the Messiah could not die. But Jesus says, no, that's actually what I have to do. And so embracing that mortality, embracing that the suffering that lay ahead of him, that's, I think, a spiritual discipline of accepting our situation in life. And that goes a long way, doesn't it? If you can come to that kind of acceptance, a peaceful acceptance that frames mortality as a Christian, I believe in the resurrection, the hope of the resurrection and the new creation and all of those things. And so I frame that sense of mortality and frailty in the context of what I believe to be Jesus's overcoming of death. But we got to go through that too. We got to go through the acceptance piece as well. But that's the thing that takes spiritual discipline and a reimagination, a reorientation of the way we understand fear, the way we understand and perceive threats to our well-being, to our security. We should live much more open-handedly as Christians than we often do. And because there are resources within our own tradition that should enable us to do that. Jesus overcame death.
Well, one of the ways that I like to think about that question is connected to the affirmation of the person's being. And I really think this is one of the more essential parts of the pastoral task, and that if our public theology is one part spoken and the other part like the lived faithfulness of the Christian community, the ability to take the risk to live prophetically as a people doesn't come when us as individuals in the congregation identities are anxious and fearful and determined by external things. And so the culturally, and this I think is inherited biologically, but also intensified in some rather perverse ways in our kind of late modern capitalist culture. But when your value and identity is determined by external things, be it things you possess, your influence, your prestige, your possessions, and then your identity's in flux. And what culturally we've done is turned all those things, whichever one you're into. Theologians tend not to be into possessions, except books, but like our entire career is based on prestige, like getting a tenure track position, getting a really sweet one with your own title like yours, Kyle. That's legit. But when whoever we're hanging out with, if our identity is still externalized, it fluctuates. Like if we're hanging out and we're like, oh, this is cool, we have a webinar, we're talking on the internet, we're feeling good. But then if Jürgen Moltmann walked in the room, we're like, and we suck. We have not going to accomplish anything. When he was our age, he'd already written 3 books cooler than all the books I'm ever going to write combined. And that was just the German versions, and we're like comparing ourselves. So to me, there's a sense that the riskiness of the gospel is intimately connected to coming to a place where your being, your personhood has been affirmed so deeply that an external existence, culturally, socially, economically, even in your own family, doesn't determine the way in which you're at home in the world. And that is such a pastoral thing. And oftentimes ministers don't realize that, especially progressive churches, and they'll go at in prophetic voice the external things that individuals in their congregation their ideology and are made idols of. And then they get into defensive posture and they're going to protect because they're protecting themselves, when the gospel is you don't even have to do that. Like, God knows you completely, loves you completely. You are the beloved of God. So you don't have to do this game. And so when as prophetic preaching and public theology discourse takes place and you remove that rather radical and basic element of the gospel, then I think it can become a burdensome word rather than an inspiring one.
Yeah, that's a great, well said. Kierkegaard in the text I mentioned earlier, Works of Love, He talks about relating to the other through God as the middle term. And I think Bonhoeffer uses some of the same language, so that basically kind of what you're describing, that our relation to God becomes the way that the lens through which we see the other. It doesn't minimize the other. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It maximizes the other by viewing them through the way that God views them, the beloved, the justified, the fully loved and all that. And then he says that we ought to wear our garments loosely, not meaning we should be able to drop our clothes at any minute, but metaphorically to say that the differentiations and the distinctions that we use to separate each other, from ourselves, such as academic titles, the number of books we've written, the how many members of your church you have, and that sort of thing. Those are all relativized. They all become essentially meaningless when you really start to reflect on the radicality of this idea of the image of God and the equality of every person in the sight of God, as equally loved, equally justified by God's grace. And relax. Don't work so hard. Don't strive so hard, because God has already accepted you.
One of the other questions that came in had a lot to do with this, and the context was really social media and online. And one of the members asked, I feel like I regularly want to select who can see and not see things I share on Facebook, not because I care if they really know what I believe, but because I don't think some people are ready to hear it. Then I feel a bit cocky that I would say that about a friend or a family member, and then I feel judged that I don't want to stand up for what I believe. And then I go ahead and post it, and then later at night I tell my uncle horrible things in the comments. So I hope that's all a half joke, but I do think that the way in which you kind of have like almost no more private moments, and people are always watching, you don't know are watching, or recording and things, has really shifted how we have conversations and the spaces we do. And I wonder how this kind of very new public square of online is shifting the way we think and speak theologically.
Yeah, that's a great question too. And you always have a choice, it seems to me, to post or not to post, to share or not to share, to like or not to like. I was listening to Mike and Mike this morning, Mike Greenberg and Mike Golick on ESPN. And they were talking about this very issue, and Mike Greenberg said, I like everything. I love everything about social media. And the one thing about it is you always have a choice. Now, as a pastor, you're in an interesting position because your congregants, your parishioners may expect you, depending on their age, to be active and to be engaged and to be commenting and making preferences known or whatever. And I've seen pastors who are very active on Facebook, very prophetic in what they do and write, very forthright. I've seen others who basically only write about sports and family, and even the sports part can be controversial. But everybody has to figure out where they're gonna land on that spectrum and what they're comfortable with. I think as a pastor, the most important use for social media, and perhaps Facebook in particular, is that you can really get a sense of where people are at and what things people are concerned about, what kind of questions they're asking, what the various spectrums are in your congregation. Now, it's not all authentic. It's not all genuine, probably, right? We mask ourselves and our activity on Facebook, best version of ourselves and all that. I think that to answer the question directly, you're probably better off being a little more cautious than less cautious, but it's up to kind of your personality And I would just say use it judiciously, but use it as a way of getting a sense of what your congregation, where your people are at.
Well, I would say one thing, especially as a minister who worked at a church large enough that when you blind carbon copy everybody, junk can get really fast. When there's 800 emails on a list for your church, and someone borrows the list inappropriately from the office and then begins to use it, things could escalate really fast. And as a minister, I found that just having the rule, like, you will talk to anyone about what they actually think, feel, and stuff, but you don't talk to anyone about what someone else does. And the beautiful thing of social media, or just a speakerphone, is that once someone else's name gets up, you can either call them, let them know, and have them join, or let them know you're talking about them, or someone can just speak for themselves. Because I think regularly Heidegger talks about the Das Man, the they, and the they is like everyone and no one at the same time. Social media just gave the Das Man like a Pokemon power up or something, and it mutated, and now the Das Man's running around terrorizing everyone. There's a liberal Das Man that every liberal's not liberal enough. There's a conservative one, every conservative's not conservative enough. And who even knows how a moderate could out-moderate themselves? But I'm sure that there's a radical centrist who hates every other form of moderateness as not being perfectly moderate. And so there's one really cool tool as a minister, because sometimes it feels good to write the email, but you don't know if you really want to send it. It's called Boomerang. It's free on the internet. Boomerang, you attach it to your Gmail. You can write the email, and it won't send it until the time you say, so you can get to the office the next morning, maybe talk to Jesus or a coworker and let them read it. You can edit it, but you already typed it, but it hadn't been sent. The other thing it does is it schedules. You can mass schedule emails to people. So if regularly you get all sorts of non-personal emails and talk about people emails coming from groups of people, you could sit down at the beginning of a month and easily write an email for every person that they get on their birthday, and you schedule it. So like using some of those technologies so that their interaction with you is of someone who like took the time to interact with them personally. You take the time using a tool to like let yourself think about it. Little things like that can model the type of responsibility you hope congregants have. But if once fires get lit, the last thing they need is gasoline. And it's amazing. Facebook is like a Phillips 76 station sometimes. One of the I don't remember how long ago. It wasn't that long ago, but Bob Dylan was getting interviewed, and he said that times are no longer changing; they've changed, and we live in a different world, digitized, globalized, interconnected, and now everything's up for grabs. We don't have any more time for just dreaming. And now, I could just be a Bob Dylan fan, which is always completely possible. But I think that gets at a real important element for American Christianity. Right now, so many of the terms and places that you imagine different groups existing and living in are ones that were established when people either loved or hated Bob Dylan and decided whether or not they liked if he went electric or not. And like so much of mainline Protestantism is still living in the Christian century and hasn't moved on. Evangelicals are holding on to the past, and they keep excommunicating their own to hold on to the glory days of Reagan and such. And so part of the challenge, I think, is for leaders of the church to ask the question, what time is it? And then allow the actual time we're in to be the space in which we speak theologically. Because if we didn't have continued healthcare and extending life, even evangelicals would be a majority supporting having open and affirming churches and having affirming gay marriage and things. It's just we have a lot more people alive that are older who write checks and maybe or maybe not have structured the economy so that the younger ones have less influence, because we got such a raw deal compared to what the baby boomers got when it comes to education debt and such. But I mean, what do you think about that, where we're at a time where the church itself may not know what time it is, and so what we intuit as the place to decide where to exist, speak, and understand is just kind of inherently dated.
Yeah, there's a real painfulness, kind of anxious, pained attempt to, in many sectors, as you just described, hold on to what we've known. And I go to a church that has a lot of older folks in it, and it's just sort of interesting to think about where's that church going to be in 15 years, in 20 years? How many people will be attending that church? How many people will be contributing financially to it? So you do start to kind of imagine, to try to understand the present in light of what it's going to look like. Mm-hmm. These given institutions and seminaries, and as you know, the seminaries are all struggling, right? Because the church is struggling. And so there's this domino effect where we're all kind of going, what in the world is going on? And part of the struggle is that we just don't know. We don't know the situation right now because it's so in flux. I mean, there's certain things we can know. We can tally up the numbers and the percentages of the decline and all those sorts of things of our institutions. But it's an interesting moment, interesting cultural moment that we're in. And it's going to take people who are creative and imaginative and yet realistic, looking at the ground and saying, this is the situation, and now here's what we can do. Here's how we can respond. It's just a fascinating time when you've got people like Russ Moore saying, I can't call myself an evangelical anymore. I mean, never would have expected to hear that, something like that from someone like him, 5 years ago even. It's just,
and if people don't know who Russ Moore is,
well, that could be part of it too. But I grew up Southern Baptist, so I forget these things from time to time that not everybody did.
Yes. So when we're thinking of the context of an election year, and that was before we had this election year, which is just a special treat. How do you understand framing those type of situations where there's not going to be a place where you're leading as a minister where everyone's actually on the same page? Just some congregations, ideology is so strong that the minority voice doesn't feel free to share it, and then there's always a sneaking suspicion as to whether or not you're deciding who is going to be the new Pharaoh, and that Moses isn't an option.
Ask the question in another way.
All right. Well, I thought I was going to try to corner you, but well, the election year. So in one sense, I know a lot of ministers just dodge it all by doing really sweet stuff called "I can't endorse a candidate," or "I'll lose my tax exempt status," which might have happened 4 times. And that I don't know. I don't know a whole lot of very sophisticated people that would think the best thing to do is to get up in a pulpit and endorse someone. Yeah. Or, like we discussed make really prescriptive statements about how to fix something. Because as a minister, that there are people that have very different vocations in your congregation, and maybe they, as different parts of the body of Christ, would actually know the best way to bring justice in those vocations more than, I don't know, their minister who went to seminary. So one way that I've thought about it is that part of your task is a descriptive one, where to describe the reality of the world and the challenge of the gospel to it prophetically and not prescribe answers.
Mm-hmm.
But during an election year, it's like no one has a hermeneutic in your congregation to hear anything as something other than partisan talk.
Yeah.
Now, historically, you could say God is partisan. It's just that God never took sides with the reigning empire of the day, so I don't think we have to worry too much about that being a political party in the United States. So there's like all these tensions that take place. So when there are these reasons to speak and not speak, I think too often ministers just start selecting the Psalms text for the lectionary, and wait till after Christmas to talk about our world again.
Yeah. It might be helpful to think about. At one level, I think that pastors are probably too scared to say anything political from a pulpit because they imagine the IRS agents just sitting outside waiting to come in, and haul them away, and that just doesn't happen. As you mentioned, you can really say anything you want about political issues, right? You can't endorse a candidate. That said, I think your point that the pastor's the prophetic role of the pastor is not to lay out concrete, specific agendas related to policy kinds of questions, I think is right. Maybe a better way to think about the prophetic task is using this critical consciousness, this reflective gaze on our situation, describing the problems that we face, and then getting to the heart of people. That is to say, how does the pastor prophetically form the kinds of people who can respond appropriately to the situations that they do face, and that in their vocations, in their jobs, in their professions, and just in life generally. So we're forming people within a community of formation, using the resources of the Christian tradition and the scriptures to peer down into the blind spots that we have, open those up, expose our prejudices, expose our inadequate understandings of God and of ourselves, so that we can be better people, better disposed to really take on these problems that we face. So, yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I've been thinking about is how you actually have way more resources than most ministers recognize in your congregation for when the prophetic imagination can be cultivated. We tend to just think that the sermon is the place that it happens, but and we talked about this in our public theology class. Some of the more powerful places to do it is in your baptisms, in the celebration of the Eucharist, communion, and even thinking about ordination, where the people that are ordained to be ministers of the gospel, especially if you're a Protestant, like every vocation is one in which a minister is occupying. If you're a priest of the believer, then you can ordain a school teacher, a firefighter, and an investment banker. And that is like insisting that our fidelity to God is not something that's privatized forms of religion, but an embodied one. And then, like in the liturgy, we regularly have prayers of confession, and the prayers of confession generically state stuff, as opposed to specifically naming it. One time, I put in prayer of confession something very specific about cycles of poverty in the prison system and it being connected to race in Los Angeles. And, that was about as factual as it gets if you live in LA. But it also got response that it would have never gotten before. And yet it wasn't like week to week we don't confess our our silence in the face of injustice, our complicity with systems of oppression. We do that all the time. But the confession is sitting there and like, what happens if we name the lived reality that we're dealing with? So, what do you think about like baptism, Eucharist, confession, ordination, or other things that are available for the pastor to guide in these type of ways?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. You think of Eucharist, Lord's Supper. You've got bread and you've got wine or grape juice, as the case may be, and I mean that's an opportunity not just for the liturgical practice and all the traditional meanings of that, but also to talk about agriculture, to talk about disparities in access to food and food deserts, and not that everything has to be about talking about things, but some way to express, through the symbol and through the action, through the sacrament, that there's more to this than meets the eye, and that there's more meaning and more challenges for us that I think we're confronted with, by and in this holy moment. So, yeah, great point.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it is just having conversations that are specific enough and connected to people in your congregation's own a service. So, like Jesus does not have like sophisticated theological conversations with people who aren't actually doing stuff with him and journeying, and like people, he empowers them, and it's like, y'all go do this, come back, we're talking about it, we're traveling and such. And yet so often the church will let people lead, talk, facilitate their witness when those people have not like fed one person in a soup kitchen in their entire life, or like gone on one trip to build to the other side of the city to help rebuild some homes for people. Like, so we can create expectations and structures in our congregations so that though the lay people who give voice to the congregation's desires are the very ones who, would have made it past the first sermon Jesus preached, like ones who are actually living as disciples, and figuring out ways to encourage and direct people. Because oftentimes, and I think a lot of us know this, that if work with seminary students, if you ask them how they got to seminary, only the few nerdy elite is because of a podcast. The others, will tell you a story either about a person who's not related to them or paid, who gave a care about their existence and it was connected to church, or someone brought them to a place where they were able to serve, care, encounter, struggle, and they realized that life was found in new depths when you did these rather basic things called love your neighbors yourself and stuff like that. That's what really brings about the passion in people that decide to, give their life vocationally. But I think it's also true for who we want leading in congregations. Being a good public theologian in a congregation means like empowering and recruiting people to be your allies. And we know the kind of things where like the Spirit of God breaks through all sorts of ideology. You befriend a person and teach them to read, you hear their story, and now public education is a very different conversation. And, there's tons of examples for stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I have two questions that were sent in to ask, and we'll ask those right after we talk about social science. But if anyone else has questions, let us know, because we're getting near the end. But I want to know why would we talk about social science?
Well, here's why. I'll say very briefly, given the time that we have here. The Righteous Mind, this book by Jonathan Haidt.
Mm-hmm.
Subtitle: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. I think it's a book that pastors should read, because it unpacks the psychology of morality and the psychology of kind of political leanings, basically. Why is it that some people are really drawn toward compassion for the poor, the oppressed, marginalized? Why is it some people are really drawn toward justice? Others are really drawn toward fairness. Others are really driven by purity concerns. Many are motivated by authority, values of tradition and staying within the confines of the system and allegiance to the leader. And so what Haidt basically shows through his kind of empirical psychological work is that people, that is us, all of us, we are not primarily motivated in our moral convictions or toward our moral convictions by rational reflection. We convince ourselves that we are. Oh, we've thought about all the issues and here's where we land, and I've considered gun control, the pros and the cons, and here's where I ended up. I'm pro or I'm against, or gun reform or whatever. And the reality is that we are motivated by intuitions, which are kind of like emotions, but those intuitions are really what drive us. And then after the fact, we rationalize and we kind of confirm the feelings, the intuitions that we already have, that are already kind of resident within us, through genetics and through socialization and through various influences on our personality, our lives. I think it's an important book because it basically kind of lays out a case for why we should be more empathetic about those that with whom we disagree. So in that sense, it's a really good help for pastors who, particularly those who pastor churches that have people who are voting for Trump and people who are voting for Clinton and people who are going libertarian and people who aren't voting at all. And how do you understand what motivates people differently within your congregation, perhaps in a way that can allow everyone, and not just you as a pastor, as a leader, but everyone in the congregation to be more empathetic toward each other. Which is not to say that everything is relative, either, right? It's not to say that you shouldn't press beyond that empathy toward what is the most just kind of way to think about an issue. What is the most responsible approach and that sort of thing as a Christian, most faithful or whatever. But I think this is just a good kind of place to sit for a while and to try to understand more empathetically where people are coming from and why it's so hard to change. Once you've sort of come to a certain place in life.
Well, so the last two questions, these were so nerdy, I figured we'd have to do them at the end. The first one, and this is someone that is in the Homebrewed Christianity Epic Reads group. So in the Homebrewed members, the membership group, we have an ongoing reading group with Philip Clayton and I through the year. We've read a bunch of books, and we recently did Plato's Republic and then City of God. And in it, we had some nice conversations. And I feel like they're trying to have you settle an argument that Phil and I had, so I won't tell you whose side you're taking. But the question is, Plato in the Republic argues against democracies for having a philosopher king and a military that can't own property. Was Plato a beautiful futurist or just old school dimwit?
Wow. That's a good question. It's been a long time since I've read The Republic, so I don't have the immediate resource on hand to go back. But, it is interesting. What was Plato going after in The Republic? What was the ultimate goal of the society that he, envisioned, this sort of utopian political organization, was to have a just society. And however he may have understood justice, differently than we might frame it today, I think that in some respects it would be really nice to have a philosopher leading our society rather than what we're probably going to end up with, which is, I don't think, a philosopher in any case, and perhaps far from it in at least one case. And so you can understand the impulse for people who are intellectually inclined to say that wouldn't it be great to have someone who can peer into the nature of reality and see things as they really are, and then help us to kind of lead. Kierkegaard actually said something interesting about in terms of privileging a monarchy over a democracy, in sort of the sense that the crowd, which he thought was untruth, can be so deceived. So I guess I'd have to say I prefer a democracy, and in any case, it's what we're stuck with. So I'm not going to answer in the end, I'm not going to answer the question or the argument between you and Philip. What's your answer?
Oh no, you're not getting an answer. No, you don't answer. I don't answer. Plus, you have to answer the last question. So, Bauman, but among others, kind of highlight how, in our contemporary context, that the kind of agreement that formed after the Reformation in the modern period between the role of the church, the economy, and the nation state is really shifted roles. So if in most of modernity, the nation state is sitting over here, and religion, it was like the advisory moral formation role for good citizens and economic actors. At this point, it's really shifted, and now the nation state is no longer the most powerful institution. It's multinational companies in a global market. And that one of the problems we're running into is the lack of recognition around the impotence of nation states. So if you think of what nation states can do, the knobs they can turn towards justice, are conversations around rights, right? And so libertarians want to turn this one up, and the progressives will turn this knob up, but every political position has some way they think they turn up the rights nozzle, and it's getting more rights or more freedom and things. And then others have like patterns of redistribution is a nozzle for, you can like turn that little knob up, maybe depending on Bernie wants to turn it up to 11 spinal style, but there's no one that doesn't advocate some form. Like Trump said, we're not just going to let a bunch of poor people not eat and die on the street. Like the heart of gold you got right there. So you got that, and then you have regulations that are either protect environment, workers, child labor laws, or that kind of stuff. But if you think of the assertion of rights, redistribution, regulation, those functioned as things the populace could use when the nation state was the real power player. But now the nation state and religion are like at the bottom of a triangle, and the economy, the multinational economy up here is there. And so in some sense, our fights are like political fights are just rearranging chairs because the power has left D.C., or at least it moved over to K Street or something.
Yeah, which sort of gives you an interesting vantage on all of the nationalism talk. That is, if you're paying attention at all to the RNC going on, there is, of course, the Making America Great Again sort of thing, and yeah, it is seen from the perspective of Hart and Negri and their conception of empire as transcending nation state boundaries, to be much more economically and technologically, globally sort of driven. It does give you an interesting vantage point on on that the polemics about nationalism that do go on. So what do they say? They say that it is the multitude, right, that has the capacity, may not be aware yet that it even has the capacity, but it has the capacity to emerge as a counter to the injustices that are perpetuated by the empire and the imperial forces. that wreak havoc on the poor and so forth. And so, is it possible that in this globalized age, through the advents of various forms of technology and interconnectedness, that a collective can emerge, not the untruth, the crowd of the untruth that Kierkegaard was talking about, but a different kind of collective of subjective selves who take responsibility for recreating the world in a better way. I think that's the interesting next question about, and maybe the next conflict that's going to be emerging, that even we're seeing in our own context with these non-traditional kind of political groups emerging and saying, no, enough is enough. And the Sanders movement was very much about that, right? To some extent.
Well, and I think that it's also a situation where the fact that the church is one of the few global bodies whose ideal is a non-cross-building Domitarian type of vision of power, where the church can have a unique public role to play in figuring out how not to die on a planet that's being run by people whose law that they're under doesn't know how to do otherwise. So,
yeah, and even in a more focused way, the church can at least be an experiment in trying to form a community that is countercultural. Mm-hmm. And many of the ways that culture perpetuates so many of the problems that plague us. And so that's a great vocation for a pastor right there.
Yeah. So, if you're listening and you enjoy this and you're saying to yourself, I think public theology is cool, then Kyle, you should tell them about the new MTS degree in public theology at United Theological Seminary. That way they can find out more about it. If they're like, I just got to level up my PT.
Absolutely. United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, we should say, has a new master's in public theology. Well, we've had a master's in public theology that was 48 credits. Now it's 36 credits. We're slimming things down, focusing the curriculum so people can get in and out quicker to get on to actually doing public theology. But it's a great preparatory degree, not just for an academic future if you're heading that way, inclined that way, but also looking to do the very kinds of things that we're talking about, prophetic, priestly functions within communities of faith to lead out in tackling some of these issues and concerns that face us. So we look at politics a bit, public theology, ethics, Christian history and tradition, and of course you get a lot of the traditional stuff that you get in seminary, Bible courses and so on, but also then some electives to shape and focus your direction as well. So you can do it at United up here in the Twin Cities. You can do it fully online from wherever you are. You can do it in Southern California, right there in the Hatchery as well, public theology. So
yeah, and one of the cool things, like you say just a Bible course, but the Bible course that we're about to do is an intensive with Walter Brueggemann on the prophetic imagination. And our Hatchery students that are doing the public theology degree will be there. We have a group of ministers who are doing their continuing ed for the year, doing it, and then we're going to have our first crossover experience where United students, for some reason, would come spend some time at the beach and hang out with Walter Brueggemann this summer. So it'd be cool. One of the things that we've been working on is figuring out how to do the classes here at the Hatchery in public theology, where you're actually doing public theology in the class. So Barry Taylor and I have worked on some classes together where your assignments and everything will be learning to build a platform to advocate and share your voice online, blogging, social media, podcasting, all that kind of stuff. You'll be doing it as you're going through your class, building your platform, and so that we have more a greater diversity and more progressive Christian voices, online. Better things for your congregants to share on Facebook. Other than Kyle's blogs.
What else do you need?
Yeah, well, I don't know, but if you do, maybe. So yeah, thanks for hanging out, and it was fun. And if you have questions, like if you're listening or viewing this later, then you should just hit us up, because I imagine more public theology conversations will happen before the election's done.
Good stuff. Thanks for having me on, Tripp.
Oh, it's fun.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Peace
Out.